All right, here we go. Today's topic, photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is really the most important chemical reaction on Earth as it pertains to biology, right? Because all living things require energy. And when you think about it, where does all that energy come from? Now, when you sit down for a meal, you sit down for a delicious steak dinner, for example, what is it that you're getting out of it? You're getting energy from it. There's biological molecules in the foods that you eat, right, that contain energy that you rely on. So where did that energy come from? Well, ultimately, the steak was a cow at one point, right, which had energy. The cow got its energy from the grass that it ate, and the grass got its energy from the sun. So ultimately, all energy on Earth and biological systems can track their origin to the sun to a greater or lesser extent. So this chemical reaction, so this is why photosynthesis is considered the most important chemical reaction on Earth. Now there are some organisms on Earth that can capture the sun's energy directly. Right? These are the ones that can photosynthesize. These types of organisms are called producers. Everybody else is what's called a consumer. So if an organism is able to photosynthesize things like plants and algae, they are producers, and everybody else on Earth relies upon those producers to capture that solar energy. So that solar energy gets captured by these sunflowers, that sunflower's energy gets passed on to the mouse, that mouse's energy gets passed on to the snake. Right? And then ultimately everybody dies, and that's where the decomposers get their energy. Right? And as we learned in the previous lecture, all cells require energy. This is consistent with the second law of thermodynamics. If you don't have an external supply of energy, then organized systems will fall apart. So all things require energy in order to sustain themselves. Now the next two lectures are actually going to discuss two rather complicated chemical processes, right? Today we'll be talking about photosynthesis. In the next lecture we'll be talking about respiration. And these two processes are exact opposites of one another. In photosynthesis, you take CO2 and water, you add energy in the form of sunlight, and you get glucose and oxygen. Right? In respiration, we're going to take the glucose and the oxygen, we're going to break it down into CO2 and water, and as a byproduct, we're going to release the energy and capture it in the form of ATP. Right? So photosynthesis and respiration are really reverse reactions. They're sort of two sides of the same coin. It's just that the photosynthesis is an overall anabolic reaction, and respiration is a catabolic reaction. But the trick is the energy that's going into photosynthesis is, it's solar energy. It's cheap, renewable, infinite solar energy. And the energy coming out in the form of, out of aerobic respiration comes out and is captured in the form of ATP. And this is how all living things sustain themselves, with these two chemical reactions. Right? So the source of all this biological energy is the sun, and this is why, again, photosynthesis is so important for biology. Now, the term producer and consumers, which I introduced a few slides ago, there are two other terms that you should be aware of, and they're autotroph and heterotroph, and they're pretty much the same terms. All right, autotrophs are organisms that can create their own food. All right, these are the producers, and the heterotrophs are the organisms that need to eat other things. So these are their consumers. So for our purposes, autotroph basically is the same as producer, and heterotroph is basically the same as consumer. All right, so the lion is a consumer, the zebra also a consumer, the producer is the grass. Right? So the autotroph is the grass, the zebra and lion are both heterotrophs. Right. Now this whole thing that we just discussed, that photosynthesis and respiration are sort of linked processes, is going to become important not just on a cellular level, but also on an ecosystem level. Right? Because on a cellular level, yes, photosynthesis creates glucose, and then the cells take the glucose and break it back down to CO2, right? But this is also happening on a very, very broad scale, right? All the plants and algae on Earth are photosynthesizing, producing sugars that all other living things rely upon, right? All other living things take the sugars that are produced ultimately from photosynthesis and break it down back into CO2 and water. Right? So this process is happening on a cellular level, but also on an ecosystem level. Right? So autotrophs, typically when you're thinking of photosynthesis, you're thinking of plants, and it's true, plants can photosynthesize, but they're not the only things that photosynthesize. Right? In the ocean, there are no plants. All that algae, those are not plants. Those are what are called protists. Right? And you can see that there's a very significant amount of photosynthesis that occurs in the ocean. Right? That being said, for our purposes today, we will be discussing plant photosynthesis because it's the one we're most familiar with. Right. So here it is. This is the chemical reaction that is photosynthesis. CO2 plus water plus energy gives you glucose and oxygen. Right. And that's the basic chemical reaction. There's a couple of things going on here that I want to point out very specifically. Number one, the net goal of photosynthesis is to create this, right? To create glucose. That's what all living things rely upon. So that's number one. The second thing is you're converting inorganic carbon to organic carbon, right? CO2 is a form of inorganic carbon, right? And then glucose is a type of carbohydrate, right? An organic molecule. And the third thing that happens is you produce oxygen. Right? We all like oxygen. Right? What happens if you don't have oxygen? You die. All right, so that's all background. Right? Last piece of background that you need to know is that light is in fact energy. Right? We tend to think of light it's hard for us to sort of visualize the fact that light is energy, but light is basically a form of electromagnetic radiation. It actually belongs on the same spectrum as gamma radiation, ultraviolet radiation, microwaves. They're all part of the same type of energy. It's just it's unique because we can see it. Now, if you're not aware, the light that comes from the sun is what's called white light, and it's a combination of many different wavelengths of light. Right? And you can separate the wavelengths of light by using a prism. Right? And then you'll get the colors of the rainbow, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. Right? And those different wavelengths of light are just the different frequencies of this electromagnetic radiation that we can see. Right? They have different energies, right? So the purples have the shortest wavelength, the reds have the longest, right? This tells you that the purple has more energy than the red does, right? And the way you know this is just beyond the purple is the UV, and just beyond the red is the IR, right? And UV is much more damaging than infrared. And so we know that purple is more powerful than red. Right? But light is a form of energy. Right. Now we tend to think of light in terms of these. We tend to think of light not as energy, but it really is in fact part of the same spectrum. Now, light energy can be captured by molecules called pigments. Right. Now we tend to think of pigments as things that give color, and they do. But the way they give color is by absorbing specific wavelengths of light. Right? So why is something red? Something is red because the pigments will absorb all of these colors of light except the red. Right? So this red apple is absorbing all the wavelengths of light and just reflecting the red, and that's what comes back at you. Right? This plant is green because it's absorbing the blues and the purples and the reds and the oranges, right? But it's reflecting the greens. So if you were to take a green plant and grow it under green light, that plant would actually die because green is the one color it doesn't need. Okay? So, just an illustration that light is in fact energy. You guys know that white light is when all the wavelengths of light are coming at you. And black light is basically, or black is when all the colors are being absorbed and nothing is being reflected towards you. Right? And now you can understand why a white car is cooler on a hot day than a black car is, right? Because the black car appears black because it's absorbing all the wavelengths of light and reflecting nothing back, right? So all that energy goes into the car, the steel and the paint. Whereas in the white car, it's reflecting more of that energy back, and why it stays cooler. Right? But the color is determined by molecules called pigments. Right? So all these colors that you see in nature, these are all the result of pigments that are absorbing specific wavelengths of light. And there are a bunch of pigments in nature, and you won't need to know any of these. Right? You probably do already know chlorophyll, which is the main molecule that is found in plants that is important for photosynthesis. Now, the one thing that's important for you to understand, for us to understand in 101, is that the pigment molecules are arranged in something called photosystems. So when I say photosystem, all I'm talking about is just this giant array of pigment molecules. So a giant solar array. So this right here, down here, is a photosystem. And you can see that all these green disks are different pigment molecules that will absorb the energy from light. Okay. And I think I already said last, but this is the last, is the geography of the chloroplast. The geography of the chloroplasts you need to understand in order to understand how photosynthesis works. So when we were talking about cell biology, we learned about the structure of a chloroplast, right? How it has multiple membranes on the outside, and the inner membrane is highly compartmentalized. Each of these little discs is called a thylakoid. And these discs get stacked up into what is called a granum. So one of these stacks is called a granum. And it's suspended within a fluid called a stroma. So just to draw that out for you. The inner membrane, that's what's called the thylakoid. And they get stacked up like this. So each individual disc is called a thylakoid. Oh no. This whole stack of pancakes is called a granum. And this is all suspended in a fluid called the stroma. So one way I like to visualize this is, imagine you're washing dishes at a restaurant or washing dishes at home. And you have a bunch of Tupperwares, right? And Tupperwares are all stacked up. Each one of these Tupperwares is a thylakoid. One stack of Tupperwares is the granum, and the dishwater that they're all sort of swimming in is the stroma. The important thing to understand here is that there's an inside of the Tupperware and an outside. Okay? So the inside of the thylakoids is called the thylakoid space. This is going to become important. Right? So there's also one here and one here as well, right? So that's the thing to understand, is that they're like Tupperwares stacked up on each other. Each of these Tupperwares is called a thylakoid. Right, and the fluid that they're suspended in is called a stroma. Alright, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of photosynthesis. This figure right here is going to be your best friend. But we need to understand what this figure is showing you. Alright, so we discussed that the whole purpose of photosynthesis is to convert CO2 and water into oxygen and glucose. But the really important stuff is this, right? that CO2 is becoming glucose. Now we understand that this is going to take some energy. And we've already discussed how that energy is going to come from the sun. But it doesn't come from the sun directly. Now there are actually two stages of photosynthesis. And those two stages are called the light reactions and the dark reactions, or the Calvin cycle. And they have two very distinct jobs. The main business of photosynthesis is converting CO2 into glucose, and that is done in the dark reactions, the Calvin cycle. And that's going to require two forms of energy. And those two forms of energy are NADPH and ATP. What? What does that mean? These are all just letters. Right? So NADPH and ATP you can think of as charged batteries. So the high energy version and then low energy. So high energy version is NADPH. And the low energy equivalent of that is NADP+. Right? And similarly, the high energy version is ATP, and the low energy version is ADP. Okay? So you can see here what's happening is this part of photosynthesis, the dark reactions, the Calvin cycle, requires these high energy forms. Right? And then that energy gets depleted, and then they become empty batteries. The empty batteries come over here to the light reactions where the sunlight charges those batteries up. Right? So they go from empty batteries to full batteries in the light reactions. That energy then goes over to the dark reactions to where it's exhausted, so that it becomes an empty battery again. The empty battery comes over here, gets charged up, etc. Okay? And this happens with two types of batteries, NADPH and ATP. All right, now we've already discussed ATP and ADP. You should understand that this has 3 phosphate groups, this has 2 phosphate groups. So perhaps it's easier to understand that ATP is the high energy version of ADP. Right? This one's a little bit different. So NADPH is the reduced form, and NADP plus is the oxidized form of the same molecule. Right? And as we discussed last lecture, reduced compounds are higher in energy. So this is reduced. Oh, geez. Reduced. Oh, and this is oxidized version. Okay. So this is why NADPH is the higher energy version of NADP+, right? Because NADPH is reduced, NADP+ is oxidized, right? If you don't understand that, all you need to understand is this, right? Charged battery becomes an empty battery as that energy is used to do this. Okay? So I told you that this is the figure that's going to save your life when you're learning photosynthesis, because it basically has everything you need to know. All right. The thing to understand is that the Calvin cycle is the important part. That requires energy. That energy comes from NADPH and ATP. These are the charged batteries. Once that energy is expended over here, they become empty batteries. These empty batteries come over here to get charged up, and then like so. So the energy goes back and forth. Okay. So we're going to start out with the light reactions, and then we'll get into the dark reactions. So it's a two-stage process. So the light reactions, remember, are going to charge up the batteries, and the dark reactions are going to use the energy from those batteries and convert CO2 into glucose. So I'm going to start over here with the light reactions. So there's going to be a lot of chemistry here, a lot of letters, and it's very easy for students to sort of just give up. Right? If at any point you feel a little bit overwhelmed I want you to go back to what we really go back to what we know. This firm, goalpost, so we know that this is what's happening. If there's only one thing that you'll remember from this, I want it to be this: that in the light reactions, what we're doing is we're charging up the batteries, right? The two forms of energy that we're looking to get are ATP and NADPH, okay? And the reason why we need to do that is because these are the forms of energy that we need in the Calvin cycle. All right? All right, here we go. So the first thing that happens is that water molecule gets split. So water molecule gets split. So if this is the water molecule, in fact, let's draw two of them. The very first thing that happens is the water molecule gets broken. All these bonds get broken. And then what's going to happen is the oxygens are going to get together to form O2. These hydrogens are going to get their electrons stripped away. So down here there'll be 4 electrons that have been stripped away from these 4 hydrogens. And these hydrogens will now become naked protons. Right? And we're going to draw naked protons as H+. Okay, so we basically disassembled the hydrogens and then made oxygen gas. So the water molecule gets split to form oxygen, these protons. The electrons are fed into a photosystem. Right? And I'm sorry about this, but this first photosystem is called photosystem 2. Right? Now remember, the whole purpose of the photosystem is to gather solar radiation, right? So that's going to gather the sunlight, and what that's going to do to these electrons, it's going to cause them to become super excited. They're going to move to a higher energy state. Then this high energy electron is going to pass through these proteins right here. See this gray blob, this gray little ball, this orange blob, and this orange ball? Right? All these guys are proteins that are lined up in a row. And what they do is they just hand the electron along. This is a series of redox reactions. This is something called an electron transport chain. So as the electron, this high energy electron, moves along through these proteins take that energy from that electron and use it to do work. And the work that we're going to do is we're going to move the protons into the thylakoid. We're going to stuff the inside. So remember, this is the inside of the Tupperware. Yeah. So we're going to use the energy from this electron to stuff the thylakoid with protons. That electron will then end up in the second photosystem, which unfortunately is called photosystem 1. That electron is going to get excited again. Whee! Go through a different electron transport chain, so different proteins here. And ultimately, it will get added to NADP+. Right, so what we're doing is we're going to reduce NADP+. Remember, when we add electrons to something, that's called reduction. We're going to reduce NADP+, and once we do that, that becomes NADPH. Now, why is this important? Remember, we stuffed all these protons inside the thylakoid. They don't want to be there. They hate being there. The natural tendency of particles is to move from an area of high concentration to low concentration, right? But we've stuffed them inside the thylakoids. So what do they want to do? They want to get out of here. And they'll trickle out through this lollipop-looking guy called ATP synthase. And as these protons diffuse out of ATP synthase spins around. And as it spins around, it will convert ADP. It's like a turbine. And as this happens, ADP and phosphate will get smashed together to form ATP. Right? So basically, we're using the energy from these concentrated protons. This is a concentration gradient, right? And as they flow out we're making ATP. Okay? So a couple of things that you really need to understand about this. Number one, an electron transport chain. We saw two of them, right? One right here, right? And one right here. And what they do is they pass the electrons along. You take this high energy electron that you got from the photosystem, you hand it along. It's like, so protein number one grabs it, so he's become reduced, hands it off, becomes oxidized, while the next guy becomes reduced. Right? And as they sort of play hot potato with this electron, that electron's sort of losing energy. But as that electron bleeds off energy, we can use it to do something productive, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to take the protons and stuff them into the thylakoid. And then in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to reduce NADP+. Right? So what they are is a long chain of proteins that are going to receive electrons and then turn around and donate them. But as they do so, they're going to do productive stuff. So this is what happens. So the electron gets stripped from water, right? Gets excited in photosystem 2. This first electron transport chain, we're going to use the energy to move the protons into the thylakoids. That electron then ends up on photosystem 1, gets excited again, whee, goes down through another series of proteins where we're going to reduce NADP+. Okay? So as the electrons have moved through these proteins here in the electron transport chain, we've stuffed the inside of the thylakoid with protons, and they get out through this little ATP synthase, causing this guy to spin around like a turbine, and that's going to generate ATP. Right? So we're going to go back and discuss these things one at a time. No, not this one. Okay. So a water molecule gets split, creating oxygen, protons, and electrons. The electrons go to photosystem 2, get excited. Whoa! Those electrons then go bouncy through the electron transport chain. The energy from the electron is then used to push the protons into the thylakoids. That electron then ends up on PS1, where it gets excited again. Whoa! Moves through this series of proteins, and will ultimately get slapped onto NADP+, turning it into NADPH. Right? This is one of the forms of energy we need. All these protons that we stuffed inside here are then going to diffuse out of ATP synthase, causing this to spin around, and that will generate ATP. All right. Now, I'm aware that this seems pretty intense, right? Because there's a lot of arrows and a lot of letters, but realistically, only 5 things are going on here. Right? It's really important not to overcomplicate what's going on. It only seems complicated because it's completely new and novel. What you're going to do when you're studying for this is you're going to take this slide, this exact slide, and you're going to go to your book and you're going to look at this picture here, and just step by step, you're going to go through and match up those 5 things on that list with what's going on in this picture, and that will really help you to visualize what's happening. All right, so just to visualize what's happening. Water splits, electron fed to PS2, gets excited, electron gets passed through electron transport chain, ends up on photosystem 1. The energy from the electron stuffs the protons into the thylakoid. Electron gets excited again, gets slapped onto NADP+ to form NADPH. All these protons that are inside the thylakoid move out of the ATP synthase, causing it to spin around. That gives us ATP. Okay? It's really only those 5 things that are happening here. And it's important not to overcomplicate things. Okay? Alright, so if you didn't understand any of that for the last 8 minutes or so. Just remember, going back to what we learned before, we're trying to get ATP and NADPH, right? So if you missed all of that, we're just jumping ahead. Those are the two forms of energy we want to get in the light reactions. Okay? So that's this. We've covered this so far. Right? The light reactions, we've taken the water, we split it, made oxygen, we've reduced NADP plus to make NADPH, and we've turned ADP into ATP. Now we're going to use these high energy forms, and we're going to feed that energy to the Calvin cycle, where we're going to make some glucose. So this is part 2. This is the business end of photosynthesis, the Calvin cycle, or the dark reactions. This is where we're going to make glucose. So we're going to take the high energy forms that we made and CO2, and we're going to turn that into glucose. All right. So here we go. So CO2 comes in. It becomes this thing called fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. It becomes all these different intermediaries, right? Which are not important. You don't need to know any of these names. But what drops out eventually becomes glucose. So what you can see here is, in effect, CO2 is becoming glucose, yeah? And I want you to see that the things that are driving this cycle are ATP, NADPH, and ATP. Those are the very forms of energy that we made in the light reactions, right? And this, you remember these guys right here? Those are the things, those are the charged up batteries that are driving this cycle, this Calvin-Benson cycle. Okay? And that's all you really need to know. Oh, sorry. You need to know that there's 1 carbon in the CO2 molecule, and there's 6 carbons in the glucose, right? So this means that this has to go around 6 times for you to make 1 glucose. I want you to see that it is a cycle. I want you to see that the only things that we're adding to it are ATP and NADPH. Okay? And the last thing I need you to know about the Calvin cycle is that this is all occurring in the stroma. So this is occurring in the dishwater. Okay, so the Calvin cycle, a lot less you need to know than the light reactions, right? Okay. Excellent. So overall, what's happening? The light reactions, we're charging up the batteries, right? We're getting ATP and NADPH. And then what we do in the Calvin cycle is we turn the CO2 into sugar, right? So this becomes that. And that's it. That's photosynthesis. So why is it so important? Well, photosynthesis is the most important chemical reaction on Earth because of this. It gives us high energy molecule, and that is what all living things rely on, right? Because this glucose that we produce is a higher energy form than this CO2, right? And the energy that we input in order to make this comes from the sun, right? So, I mean, in a very real sense, we are all solar powered, right? And that's that solar energy that allows us to resist the second law of thermodynamics and to sustain ourselves. Okay? But there's a couple of other important things that photosynthesis does, right? We get oxygen, so that's good. But I want to spend the last part of the lecture talking about this number 2, which is a really important and overlooked aspect of photosynthesis. And that is, we're turning inorganic carbon in the form of CO2 into organic carbon. Why is this important? Because we kind of need to get rid of some of that inorganic carbon dioxide in the air. Right? Now, when I was in college, and this actually still happens to a certain extent, there was a big push to go to online billing or to reduce the amount of paper. Any sort of measure that you see to reduce the amount of paper is really all about preserving the environment. Because as you can see, from the dawn of the industrial age, we've just been burning more and more and more of these fossil fuels. And every time you burn a fossil fuel, you are contributing CO2 into the atmosphere. And why is that a problem? Because CO2 is a type of greenhouse gas. Right? So what is a greenhouse gas? Now the Earth has this layer of gases around it that we call the atmosphere. And you have to understand that without this, the Earth would be super, super cold and we would all be very, very dead. Right? This layer of gases acts like a blanket or a greenhouse. So the sun comes in, and because these gases are transparent, there's no barrier to this energy. The sun's energy simply comes in. It warms the Earth, and now it becomes, instead of electromagnetic radiation, it becomes infrared or thermal energy. That thermal energy then gets trapped by these greenhouse gases and keeps the Earth relatively warm. Now the reason why it's called a greenhouse, and in California we don't really have a lot of greenhouses, but if you don't know, a greenhouse is basically a house that's made out of glass, right? And in the East Coast, they're important because it allows you to keep your plants alive. Like if you have a little garden, keep them alive in the winter because it's much, much warmer in there. So we don't have really any sort of basis to understand a greenhouse, except that we do, right? In California, on a very hot day, let's say it's 90 degrees outside, you park your car and you go in, you watch a movie or you spend a couple of hours in the mall. When you come out and you open that car door, you get hit by that blast of air, really, really hot air. That hot air is not 90 degrees. It's like 130 degrees. So how did it get to be 130 degrees inside your car? Well, it's because your car has glass around it. Right? And your car's glass acts very much like a greenhouse, the way the greenhouses in the East Coast work, and in fact the greenhouses gases of our atmosphere. The reason why your car gets to be 130 degrees is because the light goes through your glass. Right? The glass does not block the light, which is a form of energy, right? That light warms up the interior of your car. And now that electromagnetic radiation has become thermal energy, become heat. Right? And glass is an excellent insulator, so it traps the heat inside the car. Right? So in a similar way, the greenhouse gases of our atmosphere keep the Earth warm, right? So the sun's energy goes through the greenhouse gases because they're transparent, and this energy is electromagnetic radiation. When it warms the Earth, that thermal energy then gets trapped by these gases because the greenhouse gases are excellent insulators. Now by itself, the greenhouse effect is very important. Like I said, without the greenhouse effect, the temperature of the Earth would be kind of like the North Pole is now. Right? It would be extremely cold, and it would be too cold to sustain life. The problem is that all this CO2 that we've been contributing to the atmosphere has increased the amount of thermal energy that's being retained, right? And this has contributed to a phenomenon that we call global warming. So what is going on here? Well, a couple of things. Number one is we've lost a lot of our forests, right? Through burning or just the simple consumption of the forests. Right? The forests are all gone. Furthermore, we are also driven, our entire world economy is driven by fossil fuels. Right? These include oil, coal, and natural gas. And all three of these are old deposits of photosynthetic energy. So if you're not aware, oil and natural gas are the remains of old algae. And coal, the remains of old plants, so like forests and stuff. Right, so these are all organic materials, right? Living things that lived a long time ago. They died and became part of the ground. Right? all those high energy molecules that they produced in their life got locked away inside the earth and trapped. Right? And humans have figured out that these high energy molecules are great sources of fuel because they're high in energy. So we've discovered ways to find them, dig them out, and burn them. Right? And that energy has been used to fuel our global economy. So combining fossil fuel consumption and the loss of forests, we've basically contributed more and more and more of the CO2 into the atmosphere. Okay? And the extent of this is really something that I think most people don't really understand. Right? When you burn a gallon of gas, you're producing 20 pounds of CO2. Even the exhalations, like, because we breathe in to get oxygen, we breathe out to get rid of our CO2, right? Every day you're producing 2 pounds of CO2, right? And your home, that's 1 ton of CO2 in the atmosphere. So why is a push to reducing paper consumption? Why is that helpful? Because what is paper? It's made out of cellulose. And cellulose, you'll remember, is a type of polysaccharide. And what are all these things? These are all sugar molecules that were produced via photosynthesis. Exactly. So think of how many polysaccharides are here. How many millions and millions and millions of molecules of CO2 have been pulled out of the atmosphere and turned into wood, right? Because what is the major component of wood? It's cellulose. It's just sugar. If you've ever had to cut down a tree or move like a big heavy desk, like let's say the desk is 600 pounds, that's 600 pounds of what used to be air. In fact, CO2 in the air, 600 pounds of it has become that desk. So how many, literally millions and trillions of tons of CO2 have been pulled out of the air? You look at the Amazon rainforest, the largest forest on Earth. How much carbon is here? The issue is that the Amazon in particular, in fact, forests around the world, but the Amazon in particular, is being lost at an extremely high rate. And what happens to all this organic material once it's lost? It all goes back to the atmosphere, right? It gets burned, right? And it's also not growing more forest, which means no CO2 is being pulled out of the atmosphere when we lose our forests. At the same time, we're burning all these fossil fuels, right, and contributing all of this CO2 to the atmosphere. You'll notice that, under regular circumstances, the exchange of CO2 is relatively equal, right? So this is going to be respiration, that's going to be photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, respiration. It's more or less equal. Right? With the consumption of fossil fuels, there's no back arrow to it. We're not creating more coal, right? So this is the issue that we have, and why it's important to understand photosynthesis on a cellular level, on an ecosystem level, but also in terms of our current situation, because photosynthesis has changed climate and will continue to change climate. So are there things we can do? Yeah, there are things that we can do. Right? One of the things, alternatives that we look at is biofuels. Can we grow things and use that photosynthetic energy as a fuel source? And the answer is yes, we can. Right. So right now we're using, when you fill up at your Chevron station, you're filling up and you're putting in molecules that were made 50 million years ago. But what if you put in molecules that were made last year, right? You have to grow, like we grow the corn, and as the corn grows, it's pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then we turn it into fuel, and then when we burn it, that CO2 gets returned to the atmosphere. But this is the same CO2 that it's like prepaying It's like prepaying your carbon. Whereas right now, what we're doing is we're basically, living on energy credit or CO2 credit. Right? So it's really important to understand the biology behind the problems that we face before we can come up with solutions to address them. And so, even though photosynthesis is really, honestly, nobody's favorite topic to understand, it's important that you do understand why it's so important for life on Earth, how it works, a little bit about the nuts and bolts, and how photosynthesis currently impacts and will continue to impact life on Earth. All right. Okay, that's it.